All right, well, thank you everybody for coming today. This is the first of what I hope to be a series of shop talks with journalism and media communications professionals. Today we're lucky to have Vanessa McVay, a longtime journalist who has worked all over the country. She's worked in newspapers including the Seattle Times, the Raleigh News and Observer, the Columbian, and most significantly to my career, the Wenatchee World, where she hired me. So Vanessa's currently the visuals editor at Everett Community, at the Everett Herald. She teaches multimedia journalism here at Everett Community College every spring. So thank you for joining us, Vanessa. You've worked at a lot of newspapers. When did you know journalism and storytelling was going to be your path?
Fairly early in life, because I'm like a fifth generation journalist. And there was a period of time in my childhood when I wanted to be a veterinarian instead of a journalist. But I love science, but I was terrible at math. And I, kind of quickly realized that probably wasn't for me. So to move away from just strict reporting and editing, which was what my family did for several generations, I became a photographer. So that was my first journalism job, and I was doing that in junior high.
Yeah. I noticed you've done just about every job in the newsroom. You've been a photojournalist, reporter, news editor, designer, copy editor. Kind of a consistent thread through all of those jobs, though, has been this kind of penchant for visual journalism. What is it about visual journalism that speaks to you?
Well, I think because I started as a photographer, I think I just kind of trained my brain to understand visuals, more than I did writing, maybe. I'm a decent writer, but I'm not a great writer, and I'm pretty slow at writing. I much prefer the research part of, written journalism, but visuals I really took to, and honestly, I also had a mentor when I was younger, and that really made a big difference in my life as a photographer.
Very good. You've also worked almost exclusively at newspapers throughout your career. Why did you choose newspapers?
Really, newspapers were the best place to be a journalist for many, many, many years. Of course, there weren't the kind of internet options, Politico, and those kinds of places. So, really, newspapers is kind of where it's been at for me. It's a more immediate, and I really love community journalism. So.
This actually leads right into my next question. On your bio on the Everett Community College Journalism and Media Communications page, you talk about that while you have worked at very large newspapers like the News and Observer and the Seattle Times here in the Northwest, that you have your passion for small local community newspapers. What appeals to you about the smaller newspapers?
Well, I think community newspapers, and when I say that, I mean in smaller communities. So, the Seattle Times is a community newspaper for a very big city, but in smaller towns, mid-sized towns, the newspaper is very, very, very important. It's a lot more integral. It's a lot of times the only choice for local news, and so I just find it to be a lot more impactful journalism at a smaller paper. From a personal standpoint, I like variety, as you can kind of tell from all the stuff I've done, and you really have a better opportunity as a journalist to not only learn a lot of different skills, but to meet a lot of different people, do a lot of different things, and you just have a lot more of personal impact and experience at a smaller paper that I really enjoy.
You've worked at newspapers throughout the United States. Most of your career you've been up here in the Northwest, but you did some time down in North Carolina. You worked at papers in Texas as well. Any regional differences in doing journalism?
I think at its most basic, there is not. I think what has more influenced the kind of journalism that you do nowadays is through the years, the development of chains, buying family-owned and local community newspapers. So the Everett Herald is now owned by Sound Publishing, which is a Canadian company that they just took over the Seattle Weekly in the last couple of years also and completely changed it. So you have, I think that's a lot more, has made a lot more changes in the industry than any kind of regional changes. There's, in small towns, at small family-owned newspapers, there's still a very strong journalistic impulse, and you just don't see that as the priority in corporate-owned newspapers, sadly. It's much more about the bottom line.
So both of us, another thing that we shared besides our Wenatchee World roots is that we both went back and got our master's degree late in life. What made you decide to go back and get a master's degree as a returning student many years later?
I kind of hit a point, and I hit this point before I left Wenatchee World, where I thought it was very clear that a lot of things were really changing. And you really had a big influence on me also. For a while, as the internet kind of came to the forefront with, in terms of news and sharing, traditional newspaper people or media people, even TV people, kind of didn't want to deal with it. It's like, yeah, okay, we know there's this internet thing out here, but I do my job, and don't make me change my job because it's important, and what I'm doing is, what I want to do. And Andy really influenced my thinking on that this was something we needed to embrace and not reject, and that if you wanted to stay relevant, you were going to have to change your tools up. It's not changing your ethics or your skills or your what you think is important about journalism. It's just changing the tool. And so that's when I thought, well, I'm pretty old and I can probably coast this kind of work out doing what I'm doing, or I can go and learn a new tool set.
I think that several of the coworkers we've worked with over the years, that was a kind of a decision that they all had to make. It's like, am I going to try to coast to the retirement finish line, or am I going to retool to continue to be relevant? And
some are still making it. Yeah, I had gone through also, something that influenced me was I had gone through, from my childhood, I grew up in a newspaper with a press. It was downstairs, and it was a big thing to get the paper to bed, my mom in this case, and then hear those presses start rumbling. It's a very cool thing. And from that point, and that was one of the first offset presses, although some of my relatives worked in hot lead and stuff, but in my career, the big change that kept happening was digital. So we went from pasting up the paper where we would type the headlines or the stories, and they would spit out on these long strips of paper, and then some guy in the back shop would run them through a waxer. That was literally happening earlier in my career. Run them through a waxer, stick them down on a page, and that page would go off to the press, and they'd make a plate and blah, blah. And so that was really kind of a typing job, other than the writing part of it, but in terms of design, and you kind of sketched it on paper. And then pretty soon we were doing a WYSIWYG with Quark, designing pages on a computer. And then we were on Macs, and then we were in InDesign. And through those stages, I saw people, copy editors having to start laying out the pages, and they were very resentful about that. And some people who were older and very, very good copy editors, really the best, really resenting having to take their time away from what they thought was really important, dealing with the words and, cleaning up the copy, and then having to basically be a back shop guy in the way they looked at it. I thought design was a lot more important, and I really enjoyed that conversion into, computer digital design of pages. And so I saw people really resistant to learning that stuff through several phases of that. And I thought, they can't learn it because they don't want to learn it. It's not because they're not smart enough to learn it. It's not because they're not, able to do it. It's because they're frustrated because they don't want to do it. And I think that really influenced me. Sorry, that was a very long answer, but.
No, and I think that kind of that commitment to adaptability and lifelong learning is kind of the hallmark of media communications professionals that stay successful. You spent a lot of time during your career as a hiring editor, as a person that hired and fired. When looking at job candidates, what are you looking for in a successful job candidate?
Eagerness, curiosity is a huge thing. Really wanting to understand things and being interested in trying to find it out. You can be shy, you can have no experience, but if you really, really care about learning things, you can be a really great reporter or visual journalist, or really that's what it takes for any kind of journalist. And so that's what I look for. And I've hired people that just came in off the street and said, I really want to do this. I want, and I remember one moment in particular, I would send her out on an assignment and she would come back and it would be rough, but she was really easy to teach, and she was really anxious. She didn't have a journalism degree. She just had this real desire to learn how to do it and to do it well. And I think that's really what I look for the most.
The flip side of that question is that you've also had to fire people in your career. What kind of traits get people in trouble in newsrooms?
Well, I think again, it really is attitude. I think newsrooms used to be, I'm not going to say they are anymore because we are in big money trouble in most newsrooms, but they used to be very tolerant places. But not just in the racial or gender sense, but tolerant in the personality sense. People have different experiences, they're different kinds of people, and newsrooms were a place where a lot of quirky, interesting, unusual people could thrive if they were good at what they did. And so I think it comes back in terms of someone not working, it comes back to an attitude. It's their attitude about whether they want to be there and whether they want to pull their weight. But you do have to work hard, and you do have to pull your weight, and you do have to operate as a team. I've likened it many times to kind of being in the military in some ways. There's a chain of command, but everybody has a big responsibility to do their part.
The last question, the question I plan to ask every person who comes in for one of these shop talks, if you were able to talk to freshmen in college, what one bit of advice would you give them?
Freshman college. I was a very hardworking person. I had like 3 or 4 or 5 jobs through college. I, supported myself through college, and ended up with massive student loans, which I don't recommend. I think I would tell myself to focus more on the studies. I was doing useful things and working, but I think I was kind of doing the minimal amount. And when I went back for my master's, it had been years since I'd been in school, and it was really wonderful to suddenly be in an atmosphere where my job was just to learn stuff. And that is something you don't appreciate when you're younger and getting your bachelor's or in community college. It's like, this is a gift for me to be at this point in life when I'm just supposed to be a sponge, and that's great. You work for 20 years and you know, doing a kind of a daily grind. As great as the job is, you know, you have a deadline every day, and you know, you have all these expectations and a lot of stuff to do, and you need your paycheck and all that stuff. And so it's a real treat to be in school. And so I hope everybody appreciates that.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Vanessa.